Unashamed intro, S3, take one, Mark.
I'll never forget the first time I personally met a victim of human trafficking. It seems so long ago now, but nothing could have prepared me for that moment. I walked into one of our transition homes at the A21 campaign and I saw a young woman and she was cowering in a fetal position on the floor in a corner. She was shaking uncontrollably and unable to look at me. She was full of fear because of all the trauma that she'd encountered, having been raped at least 20 times a day for the previous 2 years before this time that I met her. And the traffickers had basically broken down her sense of self-esteem and any sense of self-worth or value that she had by systematically and methodically beating her and raping her nonstop. And she now essentially believed herself to be worthless, to be guilty, at fault, like it was her fault. She felt unloved and that she was unlovable. It was really gut-wrenching, to be honest, to see how a young woman who'd been the victim of such unspeakable abuse had ended up believing the lie that something bad happened to her because essentially there's something fundamentally flawed with her. She thought there was something wrong with her, that's why it happened to her. And in many ways, I can understand these feelings and I can understand the girl's questions and the responses of these precious victims. I can never remember a time that as a child I didn't feel ashamed of who I was, and this largely because I had been sexually abused. At first I can remember when I was a little girl, I was ashamed of what was happening to me, what the abusers were doing to me. But then as you're trapped in your own thoughts over time, there was a shift in my thinking where I began to believe the lie that really came straight from the pit of hell, that this was happening to me because there was something wrong with me. So rather than thinking that what was happening to me was wrong, I began to think I was wrong. That's why it was happening to me. And it was that lie, of all the other lies in my life that I believed, it was that lie that kept me shackled in shame for decades of my life. And it impacted every aspect of my life, of my actions, of my relationships, of my choices, and my fundamental belief system. I had this never-ending recording in my head. It never stopped. It never kept quiet. And it just kept playing the question in my brain, what is wrong with me? What is wrong with me? There's something wrong with me. And even when I was no longer being abused, I still had that tape recorder playing in my head. It was kind of like on automatic, just repeat, repeat, repeat. And when I became a Christian, I still had that tape recorder playing in my head. And I was delivered the moment I got saved. I was heaven bound. But I was not yet walking in the fullness of the freedom that Jesus had purchased for me. Freedom would require a very long and painful process. It would not be easy, nor was it going to happen overnight. But I had to determine that I was going to go in and possess the freedom from shame that Jesus had secured for me on that cross. It was for freedom that Christ set me free. And I wanted the fullness of that freedom. And more than anything, I want you to experience the freedom that a shame-free life can bring to you. I've discovered that there's a huge difference between living delivered and living free. Many of us have experienced what it is to be free from the physical bondage of being in slavery, perhaps to an addiction or having been abused, but we've not yet encountered the blessing of appropriating the fullness of the promise of God in every aspect of our lives and therefore living in victory in the promised land in freedom. So I found that the journey from shame-filled to shame-free living parallels the journey that the children of Israel had to take as they came out of slavery in Egypt and stepped into the wilderness and then finally made the decision to go in and possess their inheritance. There's so much that we can learn from this story. So why don't you turn with me today to the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to read chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. And the Bible says, these are the words Moses spoke to all Israel in the wilderness east of the Jordan. That is in the Arabath opposite Suph between Paran, Tophel, Laban, Hazareth, and Dizahab. It is 11 days journey. I want everyone right now to just stop and say 11 days. That's right. It is 11 days journey to go from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the Mountain Seir Road. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month. I don't want you to miss the disparity between 11 days and now we've jumped into the 40th year. Moses proclaimed to the Israelites all that the Lord had commanded him concerning them. This was after he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, and at Edrei had defeated Og, king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth. East of the Jordan, in the territory of Moab, Moses began to expound this law, saying, the Lord our God said to us in Horeb, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. Break camp and advance into the hill country of the Amorites. Go to all the neighboring peoples in the Arabah, in the mountains, in the western foothills, in the Negev, and along the coast to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the Euphrates. See, I have given you this land. Go in and take possession of the land the Lord swore he would give to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to their descendants after them. So what we actually see in this text is that the children of Israel took 40 years to accomplish an 11-day journey. In fact, that portion actually took 38 years. But can you even believe that? It's crazy to look back and see that fear, doubt, and unbelief had kept them out of their promised land. They settled for so much less than God had promised them because they were not willing to go through the painful possession process. The Lord said to Moses, see, I've given you this land, now go in and take possession of it. So there came a point where the Israelites had to decide to get up. They'd been at that mountain too long, break camp, and go in and possess. That's going to happen to every single one of us. There's a point where you have to get up, break camp, make the decision, I'm going to go in and possess. The purpose of coming out of Egypt was to go into the promised land of Canaan. It wasn't to live in the wilderness. Like, make no mistake, they were always going to walk through a wilderness to get to the promised land, but it wasn't supposed to be a 40-year process. The wilderness was supposed to be a season where God could do a work in the hearts of the Israelites to change their thinking and to change their mentality. It took one spectacular moment for the Lord to part the Red Sea and to take the slaves out of Egypt. But it was going to take a little bit longer to take the slavery mentality out of the slaves. So for 430 years, the children of Israel had been beaten, they'd been ridiculed, they'd been mocked, they'd been scorned, and essentially treated as subhuman beings. They were overlooked, they were discarded and ignored. So their broken hearts, their wounded souls, and their tormented minds very much needed to be restored and renewed and reset in the wilderness so that they would know how to live and to thrive in the promised land. You see, they weren't designed to live in slavery, but they were designed to live in freedom. But it's very difficult to learn to live in freedom when all you've ever known is slavery. So slaves have an entirely different worldview than the people that live in freedom. So God had to change the way that the children of Israel thought, acted, and saw themselves if they were going to live and thrive and prosper in the promised land. So basically they had to stop learning to kind of just survive and exist and trying to get a victory to learning how to live from victory in the promised land. It's an entirely different mentality that was required. Well, it's exactly the same for you and for me in our journey from shame-filled to shame-free living. What happens is we come out of situations where we have been shackled up in shame, and then we need time to renew our minds, our habits, our behaviors, and our reactions so that we can live victoriously in the promised land. We've often been trapped in shame-filled living, thinking, believing, behaving, and responding for so many years that you just can't change these things overnight. And the person that comes out of slavery can't be the same person that walks into the promised land. You have to experience a change in the wilderness in between slavery and the promised land. Now, here's the sad thing. Many Christians never ever cross over into our spiritual promised land because we get stuck in the wilderness. And what happens is, in this biblical account that I'm talking about, an entire generation, except for Joshua and Caleb, died in the wilderness, and they estimate that's up to 2 million people because they did not have the faith to go in and possess their inheritance. So they had lived delivered from Egyptian slavery, but they'd never encountered living in freedom in Canaan. Now, there was a very long season in my life that I too was delivered but not free. I was no longer in that situation where I was being abused, but I did carry much of that residue and the consequences of what happened to me into every day. I still acted like a victim of abuse even though I had been delivered from the abusive situation. I had to undergo a painful season in the wilderness for many, many years where I had to allow God to replace the damaging repercussions of the shame-filled living in my life with the truth of His Word and with His promises. I had to learn to let go and to trust God, and it was not easy and it was deeply painful, but I want you to know, look me in the eyes, it was also entirely worth it. I wouldn't trade one moment of that time. I found Jesus in that wilderness like I had never known Him before. And I want you to take a few moments, maybe right now, to just think back over your own life and think back at a time where you were shamed. Ask yourself, have you somehow gotten stuck in that moment and the reaction that you had, the responses, the feeling? Have you brought that moment into your present moment now? So even though your body's here today, everything about your life, your thinking, your emotions, your heart, your reactions, your responses, the way you believe, the way you live, is it actually still stuck in that moment from your past? Have you allowed one moment, one season, or one chapter of your life to determine your entire life? And the truth is, I speak all around the world and I meet women everywhere who have been stuck in a moment of shame. And instead of bringing that shame to the foot of the cross of the one who bore our shame and leaving it there, they carry a burden with them that they were never designed to carry into each and every day. In a sense, basically what happens is you simply keep doing laps around the same old mountains of shame, of fear, of doubt, of insecurity in the wilderness. You've never made a decision to go, you know what, I've been here too long, to break camp, move forward, and to go in and possess the freedom that Jesus has obtained for you on the cross. You've been delivered from that moment of slavery, but not set free. You're not physically back there, but you know what? You're not really stepping into the future that Jesus has for you in your spiritual promised land. It is astounding when I'm signing books off and how many women, maybe in their late 50s or 60s or 70s, tell me, and perhaps I'm the first person that they've ever shared this with, Christine, I had a baby 40 years ago, nobody knows. And I gave that baby up for adoption and I carry that shame with me. Or Chris, I had an abortion and nobody knows about it. Or I had an adulterous affair. And you know what? They're still stuck in that moment 20, 30, 40, 50 years later because they never brought that moment to the foot of the cross. So they've lived bound, delivered, no longer in that moment, but not free to walk into the fullness of what Jesus has for them. Maybe your marriage failed and your spouse left you for someone else and you've been stuck in that moment that you are unworthy of anyone's love. Maybe you were promiscuous for a season and somewhere along the line, you just have not been able to let go of the shame of that. Maybe you abandoned a child, or maybe you had a failed business venture. The truth is that one moment, that one missed opportunity, that one mistake, that one failure, it does not need to define your life. Your life can be defined by a far more powerful moment, and that's the moment that Jesus Christ died on the cross. You could choose today to go in and possess your freedom rather than keep circling that same old mountain of shame. I want to acknowledge the fact that as long as we're alive on this earth, You and I are routinely going to go through periods where we come out of bondage in one area, and then we need to walk through a spiritual wilderness and unlearn certain things and allow God to fill us with the truth of His Word in other areas, and then walk into the freedom that He has for us. Now, sometimes these seasons are dramatic, like the one I talked about many years ago that lasted for a really long time, and it was all-consuming. But at other times, they are less overwhelming, but still very real. And all of us would love to bypass the wilderness. But I've discovered that despite our best efforts, there are no shortcuts. Remember, I'll keep saying it. There are no drive-through breakthroughs. You've got to go through the wilderness to get into your promised land. There is no easy way through. But Jesus is with you in the midst of the wilderness. How we go through is really actually up to us. And we can take the faster, more direct route, or we can creep along, dragging our feet like the children of Israel and wandering all over the place. It's in the wilderness season of our lives that God actually strengthens us and prepares us to overcome the inevitable giants that we are going to face in our promised land. It's this place that we cycle through over and over, always getting freer and freer from shame each time. It's not an unexpected detour. It's not a wrong turn. You haven't made a mistake in your navigation. This is the path to freedom that God has chosen. Remember, the wilderness, it's never a place we go looking for. When we find ourselves there, we tend to use words like being thrust into the wilderness, or lost in the wilderness, or wandering through the wilderness. But I want you to know, and this is going to give some of you a lot of hope today, God's actually leading us in the wilderness. He's preparing us for what He's already prepared for us. He's changing our thinking. He's transforming our inner man. He is delivering and freeing us and conforming and transforming us to His image. We just have to decide that where He leads, we will follow. God's goal for us is freedom, true spiritual freedom, a life that's no longer bound by the weight of shame's false guilt and relentless regret, a life that's no longer haunted by shame's fears and worries, and no longer captive to shame's old habits and our self-protective responses that keep us repeating those same old shame-filled patterns. And though we've all had different experiences, we share common challenges in our wilderness journey when everything familiar and secure is just stripped from us, and it's really just us and Jesus. We might have been delivered from our shameful experiences, but until we learn to trust God in the wilderness by exposing our baggage and allowing Him to heal all of those broken places, we will never experience true freedom. We'll continue to hide behind the defense mechanisms that we've developed that have empowered us to somehow survive in the wilderness. And these mechanisms, I talked about some of my own, but these mechanisms are like never getting too close to anyone so that we can't be hurt again, or maybe performing for acceptance, or trying to earn love and approval by people-pleasing all the time. And my specialty, perfectionism. Let's never make a mistake. Let's control everything. Or perhaps escaping through various addictions, or going from one partner to another, or hiding and minimizing who we really are. We've all got experiences, and we've all had experiences that we need to overcome. The wilderness is where we learn to do that. God leads us there to bring us out of hiding and prepare us for what He has in store for us. He leads us there to free us. And once we've made the decision to break camp, to go in and possess the promise of freedom, then we're going to need to listen to the words that the Lord spoke to Joshua. He said, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." There is so much we can unpack there. It takes strength and courage to walk in freedom. Shame-free living is definitely not for the faint of heart. It's a lot easier actually to just stay where you are, to not break camp, to keep doing laps around the mountains of shame until you die. That's really where a lot of people live, because that's easier than getting up, making the decision to go in, embrace the pain of recovery, and possess your freedom. Shame is essentially fear-driven. I think that's why the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid, because it whispers to us relentlessly. It says to us, no one's going to like you if they knew what you were really like. You don't deserve any better than what you have right now. You know your future is just going to keep being more of your past. You will fail again. You can never change. I want you to know that a life liberated from fear it's one of the most powerful forces on the planet. God wants you to move forward, and it's going to take faith to do that. You'll need to put more faith in what you do know about God than in what you don't know about the future, because you're stepping into an unknown future, but you're stepping into that unknown future with a very known God. God's not given us a spirit of fear, 2 Timothy tells us, but one of love, power, and a sound mind. So I want to encourage you, you can do hard things. It's not easy to drop the baggage of shame. If it was, all of us would have dropped it all by now. But ultimately, it comes back to this. It comes back to trusting the character and nature of God. Do you trust that God is a good God and that He wants to walk into a shame-free future with you, even if bad things have happened to you in the past? I have to admit to you, see, that was a really big hurdle for me to overcome. And it required a lot of strength and a lot of courage on my behalf. Could I trust that a God who seemed to me to allow bad things to happen in my past, could I trust that this God really did have a great future for me? I think once I jumped that hurdle, it was amazing. Because what fear does, fear tries to stop us from getting into the presence of God or from trusting God so that we will never be free. Remember, God doesn't ask us to be totally fearless, but He calls us to be faithful. Do you think you can do that? Do you think that you could be maybe more full of faith than you are full of fear? So you don't have to be totally fearless, just more faithful. Can you do it afraid? Can we be more full of faith than we are of fear? I mean, just a millimeter more? You know, at some point we're going to have to choose to stand up and take that step of faith into the unknown future with a very known God. I want you to know that Jesus is there for you. Jesus will catch you. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. He loves you. He cherishes you. He adores you. I want to encourage you. Trust Him today and go in and possess your freedom from shame.